Commander Zefek stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked out at the stars with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. 300 years of military service had taught him that war was a simple matter of planning and execution. The Korthani Empire had rules for everything, and those rules had brought them victory across 17 star systems. He had personally overseen the conquest of 12 different alien species, and each campaign had followed the same predictable pattern. The alien commander adjusted his ceremonial armor as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports from the Outer Rim territories. A new species had been discovered in a small solar system that humans called Earth. The reports painted a picture of a primitive civilization that spent most of its time fighting itself. Their technology was crude compared to Korthani standards, and their ships looked like metal boxes with engines attached. Most amusing of all, they had no unified government and seemed to enjoy making war on each other for the smallest reasons. Zefak had seen this pattern before with other primitive species. They would fight among themselves until a superior force like the Korthani arrived to bring order and civilization to their chaotic existence. The process was always the same. Show overwhelming force, demand surrender, accept their submission, and integrate the useful members of their society into the empire. Those who refused to cooperate would be removed from the equation permanently. The intelligence data showed that humans had been fighting wars for their entire recorded history. They had developed weapons specifically designed to kill other humans, and had refined their methods of destruction over thousands of years. To Zefak, this seemed like evidence of their primitive nature, rather than any kind of military sophistication. Civilized species learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation and established protocols. Only barbarians resorted to constant violence. His tactical officers had prepared detailed analyses of human military capabilities, and the conclusions were predictable. Human ships were slow and poorly armed compared to Korthani vessels. Their weapon systems relied on primitive chemical explosives and kinetic projectiles rather than advanced energy weapons. Their defensive systems appeared to be almost non-existent, and their fleet organization showed no understanding of proper military formation. The Korthani had perfected warfare through careful study and adherence to proven principles. Every battle followed established patterns that had been tested across centuries of conflict. Formations were maintained, communication protocols were followed, and victory was achieved through superior technology and tactical discipline. The idea that a species might fight without following these basic rules was simply incomprehensible to someone like Zefak. He requested permission from the High Command to lead the subjugation fleet personally. This would be an easy victory to add to his already impressive record and would provide valuable training opportunities for younger officers. The human homeworld represented exactly the kind of target that the Empire specialized in conquering: divided, primitive, and completely unprepared for the reality of facing a truly advanced military force. The briefing materials included recordings of human conflicts, and Zefak watched them with growing amusement. Humans seemed to have no concept of honorable combat or proper military procedure. They used deception, attacked civilian targets, and employed tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Their soldiers showed no discipline, and their commanders appeared to make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. What struck Zefak as particularly pathetic was how humans seemed to take their conflicts personally. Proper military commanders understood that war was a political tool used to achieve specific objectives. Emotions had no place in professional military operations. Yet the human recordings showed soldiers who appeared to be fighting out of anger or hatred rather than duty to their government. The Korthani approach to conquest had been refined over millennia and had never failed. Superior firepower combined with disciplined tactics would overwhelm any primitive resistance. The humans would quickly realize that further fighting was pointless and would accept integration into the empire. Their crude technology might have some novelty value, and their biological diversity could prove useful for certain types of labor. Zefak began planning the campaign with the same methodical approach he had used for all his previous conquests. The fleet would arrive at the edge of their solar system and deliver the standard ultimatum: When the humans inevitably rejected the generous offer of peaceful surrender, the fleet would demonstrate overwhelming force by destroying a few military targets. This display would convince any reasonable human leadership that resistance was futile. The commander felt a familiar satisfaction as he reviewed the fleet composition and tactical plans. Everything was proceeding according to established protocols, and there was no reason to expect anything other than complete success. War might be nothing new to someone with his experience, but it never stopped being satisfying when executed properly. His staff officers shared his confidence as they prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the shortest campaigns in Korthani military history. The humans had no idea what was coming their way and would soon learn what it meant to face a truly superior military force. The Korthani fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the human solar system with all the ceremony and precision that 3 centuries of military tradition demanded. Zefak watched his ships form perfect battle lines as they broadcast the standard conquest ultimatum on all frequencies. The message was simple and had been used successfully dozens of times before. Surrender immediately and accept peaceful integration into the Korthani Empire or face the complete destruction of your civilization. The human response came faster than expected, but in a form that left Zefak staring at his communication screens in confusion. Instead of the diplomatic overtures or formal surrender that usually followed such ultimatums, the humans transmitted what appeared to be a collection of crude insults directed at Korthani anatomy and ancestry. The final line of their message was even more puzzling. "Come and take it if you think you can." Admiral Jake Morrison commanded the human fleet from his flagship, a battered vessel called the UES Defiance that looked like it had been built from spare parts and determination. His response to Zefak's ultimatum was broadcast across all human military frequencies and somehow managed to be both defiant and dismissive at the same time. Morrison's message included references to various human conflicts and ended with what the translation computers identified as a particularly offensive human gesture. Zefak had encountered stubborn resistance before, but never anything quite like this. Most civilized species at least attempted to negotiate or requested time to consider their options. The humans seemed to be treating the entire situation as some kind of personal insult rather than a simple political reality. Their response showed no recognition of the overwhelming technological advantage that the Korthani fleet represented. The Korthani commander decided to proceed with the standard demonstration of force. He ordered his heavy cruisers to target the primary human military installations on their homeworld and destroy them with precise orbital bombardment. This usually convinced any remaining resistance that further fighting was pointless and led directly to surrender negotiations. The bombardment proceeded exactly as planned, and several major human military bases were reduced to smoking craters within minutes. Zefak expected immediate communications from human leadership requesting terms for surrender. Instead, the human fleet began moving in patterns that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Human ships broke formation and scattered across the solar system in what appeared to be completely random directions. Some vessels headed directly toward the much larger Korthani fleet in what could only be described as suicide runs. Others seemed to be fleeing toward the outer planets while broadcasting messages that the translation computers were having difficulty processing. Lieutenant, Commander Amy Rodriguez led a squadron of human fighters in an attack that violated every principle of space combat that Zefak had ever learned. Her ships approached the Korthani fleet in a loose formation that offered no mutual support and exposed each vessel to concentrated enemy fire. When the Korthani defensive systems began targeting the human fighters, Rodriguez ordered her pilots to do something that left the alien commander speechless. The human pilots began using their own ships as guided missiles. They would accelerate directly toward Korthani vessels while overloading their reactors and then eject at the last possible moment. The resulting explosions were powerful enough to damage even heavily armored Korthani cruisers, and the psychological effect on Korthani crews was devastating. Zefak watched in growing bewilderment as his perfectly organized fleet formations began to fall apart under the assault of what appeared to be organized chaos. Human ships ignored proper targeting priorities and seemed to attack whatever targets presented themselves. Some human captains broadcast taunting messages while engaging in maneuvers that should have torn their primitive vessels apart. The most disturbing aspect of the human response was their complete disregard for their own casualties. Korthani military doctrine emphasized the preservation of trained personnel and expensive equipment. Losses were to be minimized through superior tactics and overwhelming firepower. The humans seemed to view their ships and crews as expendable resources to be used up in pursuit of victory. Captain Ryan Sullivan commanded a human destroyer that had taken severe damage early in the engagement. According to all military logic, he should have withdrawn his vessel or requested terms for surrender. Instead, Sullivan turned his crippled ship toward Zefak's flagship and began broadcasting a message that chilled the Korthani commander to his core. "You picked the wrong species to mess with," Sullivan announced as his damaged destroyer accelerated toward the Korthani command ship. "We've been killing each other for thousands of years, and we're really good at it. Time for you to find out." Just how good? The destroyer's reactor was deliberately overloaded, and the resulting explosion took out 3 Korthani cruisers along with Sullivan's ship. The human captain had turned his vessel into a weapon and used it with devastating effect against an enemy that was supposedly superior in every way. Similar scenes were playing out across the battlefield as human commanders made decisions that defied every principle of rational military strategy. They fought like beings possessed, showing no concern for odds or casualties. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. Zefak realized that he was not facing the kind of organized military resistance that his forces had been trained to overcome. The humans were fighting like a pack of wild animals that had been cornered and had decided to take as many enemies with them as possible. Their tactics were unpredictable because they appeared to be making them up as they went along. The Korthani fleet was still winning in terms of total casualties inflicted, but the cost was far higher than anyone had expected. More importantly, the humans showed no signs of recognizing that they were losing or any inclination to surrender despite suffering devastating losses. What Zefak had initially dismissed as primitive desperation was beginning to reveal itself as something far more dangerous than anything he had encountered in 3 centuries of warfare. The humans refused to follow any of the established rules that governed civilized conflict, and their complete disregard for conventional military wisdom was starting to take a serious toll on Korthani forces. The breakthrough came when Zefak captured several human prisoners and attempted to interrogate them using standard psychological techniques. Most alien species would provide useful intelligence when faced with the reality of their situation. The humans responded to questioning by providing detailed descriptions of various methods they intended to use to kill their captors, complete with technical specifications and personal recommendations. One captured pilot named Gary Stevens spent his entire interrogation session explaining how human conflicts had taught them to turn everyday objects into weapons. He described with disturbing enthusiasm how humans had learned to make explosives from common household chemicals and had developed ways to kill enemies using everything from sharpened sticks to modified farming equipment. The intelligence that emerged from these sessions painted a picture of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history perfecting the art of killing other humans. They had not developed advanced technology to explore the universe or improve their living conditions. Instead, they had focused their scientific advancement almost entirely on developing better ways to destroy their enemies. Captain Ryan Sullivan had not been the exception among human commanders. Ground battles were revealing that every human seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of warfare that went far beyond formal military training. Civilian populations that should have been fleeing to safety were instead constructing improvised fortifications and weapons. Dr. Lisa Parker had been a medical researcher before the invasion began, but had somehow transformed herself into a demolitions expert who specialized in creating booby traps from medical equipment. Her hospital had become a fortress that Korthani ground forces could not approach without suffering heavy casualties from devices that seemed to have been designed by someone with an intimate knowledge of alien anatomy. Mechanic Tony Vasquez had spent the first week of the invasion modifying civilian vehicles into mobile weapons platforms. His workshop had become a production facility that was turning out armored cars equipped with weapons that had been improvised from industrial machinery. The vehicles looked crude, but were proving devastatingly effective against Korthani ground forces. What disturbed Zefak most was discovering that human children were actively participating in combat operations. 16-year-old volunteers were serving as spotters and message runners for military units. Elderly humans who should have been seeking shelter were instead providing intelligence about Korthani troop movements and helping to coordinate resistance activities. The entire human population seemed to view the invasion as a personal insult that demanded immediate and violent response. There was no distinction between military and civilian targets because every human was apparently a potential combatant. They fought with a level of personal investment that made no sense from a strategic perspective. Traditional Korthani tactics relied on breaking enemy morale by demonstrating superior firepower and tactical discipline. The humans seemed to take each demonstration of Korthani's strength as a challenge to be overcome rather than a reason to surrender. They studied Korthani weapons and tactics with the focused attention of students preparing for an examination. Major Karen Thompson commanded human ground forces using a mixture of tactics that seemed to have been borrowed from dozens of different conflicts throughout human history. She combined ancient siege warfare techniques with modern technology in ways that created tactical problems the Korthani had never encountered before. Her forces would use primitive spears and arrows when sophisticated weapons were not available. They employed psychological warfare techniques that included broadcasting recordings of human music during attacks. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to genuinely enjoy the challenge of fighting against superior technology. Sergeant Nick Collins demonstrated human adaptability by capturing Korthani weapons and improving them beyond their original specifications within hours of first encountering them. His modifications were so effective that other human units began requesting captured alien equipment specifically so that Collins could upgrade it for use against its creators. The humans were learning faster than the Korthani could adapt their tactics. Every engagement provided them with new information about alien weaknesses, and they shared this intelligence across their entire military network with remarkable efficiency. They treated each battle as a learning experience rather than a test of strength. Zefak found himself facing an enemy that seemed to evolve during combat. Human tactics that failed in one engagement would be modified and improved for the next encounter. They showed no attachment to failed strategies and no hesitation about abandoning approaches that were not working. The most unsettling discovery was that human military leaders like General Patricia Stone were actively studying Korthani doctrine and developing countermeasures faster than Korthani strategists could implement new approaches. She seemed to understand alien psychology better than many aliens understood themselves. Human communications that Korthani intelligence managed to intercept revealed that they were treating the entire conflict as an opportunity to test their theories about warfare against a completely new type of enemy. They discussed Korthani tactics with the analytical detachment of scientists examining interesting specimens. The aliens had expected to face a primitive military force that would be overwhelmed by superior technology and tactical discipline. Instead, they were fighting an entire civilization that had apparently spent thousands of years preparing for exactly this kind of conflict. As the conflict dragged on far longer than any previous Korthani campaign, Zefak began conducting a more detailed study of human history and discovered something that made his blood run cold with recognition and fear. The humans had not been fighting random conflicts throughout their history, but had instead been engaged in a continuous process of military evolution that had refined their ability to kill into something approaching an art form. Every human war had introduced new weapons, new tactics, and new ways of thinking about conflict. They had learned to fight in every possible environment from deep oceans to high mountains. They had developed specialized techniques for urban warfare, jungle combat, desert operations, and Arctic conditions. Most importantly, they had learned to adapt their methods based on the strengths and weaknesses of different types of enemies. The intelligence files revealed that humans had fought wars against enemies using cavalry, gunpowder, chemical weapons, nuclear devices, and electronic warfare systems. Each conflict had taught them something new about the nature of combat, and they had incorporated these lessons into their overall understanding of how to destroy their opponents effectively. Commander Steve Harrison led human naval operations. With a combination of tactics borrowed from ancient sea battles and modern space combat techniques. His fleet movements showed influences from historical commanders who had lived thousands of years before space travel was even possible. The humans were applying lessons learned from fighting other humans to the problem of fighting aliens. Major Karen Thompson continued to demonstrate this historical integration by employing siege techniques that had been developed during medieval conflicts alongside modern weapons systems. Her forces would surround Corthani positions using ancient principles of encirclement, while calling in orbital strikes using communications technology that the original developers of siege warfare could never have imagined. The most disturbing aspect of human military development was their approach to studying their own conflicts. They had created detailed records of every major battle and had analyzed these engagements to identify successful techniques that could be applied to future wars. Human military academies taught courses on historical conflicts as practical training for modern officers. Sergeant Nick Collins represented this tradition perfectly as he continued modifying captured Corthani equipment using principles he had learned from studying how humans had adapted enemy weapons during their own historical conflicts. He treated alien technology as just another engineering challenge to be solved through systematic experimentation and creative modification. Navigation Officer Beth Cameron was calculating hyperspace jumps that pushed human ships beyond their design specifications by applying mathematical principles that had originally been developed for artillery targeting during ancient human conflicts. She was using knowledge gained from studying ballistic trajectories to plot courses through folded space with deadly accuracy. The humans were not just fighting the Corthani invasion, but were actively studying it as another chapter in their ongoing education about warfare. They recorded every engagement, analyzed every tactical decision, and shared their findings across their entire military network. The invasion was becoming a learning laboratory for human military science. HFY intercepted human communications discussing how different alien combat techniques compared to methods used by various human armies throughout history. Human officers were drawing parallels between Corthani tactics and strategies employed during conflicts that had occurred hundreds or even thousands of years earlier. Dr. Lisa Parker had expanded her medical knowledge into chemical warfare by studying historical examples of how humans had used poison gas, biological weapons, and other unconventional approaches to killing their enemies. Her improvised weapons were becoming increasingly sophisticated as she applied lessons learned from human conflicts to the challenge of fighting aliens. Ground combat was revealing that individual human soldiers possessed an intuitive understanding of tactics that went far beyond their formal training. They seemed to inherit knowledge from thousands of years of human warfare through cultural transmission and military tradition. Even civilians demonstrated combat skills that suggested they had been exposed to military thinking from childhood. Construction. Worker Greg Miller was building fortifications using techniques that combined modern engineering with defensive principles that had been developed during historical sieges. His barriers were designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones while providing maximum protection for defending troops. Teacher Claire Adams had transformed her knowledge of human psychology into an understanding of how to demoralize enemy forces through carefully planned psychological operations. She was broadcasting messages designed to exploit Corthani cultural assumptions and create doubt among alien troops about the wisdom of continuing their invasion. The humans were treating the alien invasion as an opportunity to test their accumulated knowledge about warfare against a completely new type of enemy. They approached each engagement with the systematic thoroughness of scientists conducting experiments rather than soldiers fighting for survival. Human military leaders were sharing information about successful tactics almost immediately after discovering them, What worked for one unit would be transmitted to other forces and implemented across the entire human military network within hours. They were learning and adapting faster than the Korthani could modify their own approaches. Zefak realized that he was not fighting a primitive species that happened to be unusually stubborn. He was facing the end product of thousands of years of continuous military evolution, guided by a species that seemed to view warfare as their primary form of technological and social development. The turning point in the conflict came when Zefak made what he believed would be a decisive strategic move, but which instead triggered something in the human psyche that he had never encountered in 3 centuries of conquest. Following standard Korthani doctrine for breaking stubborn resistance, he ordered the orbital bombardment of a major human civilian center to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. The target was a city called Denver that served as a regional population center but had no significant military value. The bombardment was intended to convince human leadership that the Korthani could destroy their civilization whenever they chose, and that further resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties among their own people. The destruction of Denver proceeded exactly as planned, and the city was reduced to radioactive rubble within minutes. Zefak expected immediate communications from human leadership requesting terms for surrender and an end to hostilities. Instead, something changed in the human response that made the previous fighting seem restrained by comparison. The humans stopped holding back. Every human military communication that Korthani intelligence intercepted after the Denver bombardment carried a different tone than previous messages. The casual defiance and crude humor that had characterized earlier human responses was replaced by something far more dangerous. The humans were no longer fighting to defend their territory, but were now fighting for revenge. Commander Steve Harrison led the human response with a fleet of converted civilian vessels that had been modified into weapons platforms using techniques that defied every principle of military engineering. His ships were not designed to win battles through superior tactics or technology, but were instead intended to inflict maximum damage on Korthani forces regardless of the cost to human crews. The human fleet attacked with complete disregard for their own survival and began employing tactics that violated every civilized rule of warfare that the Korthani had ever encountered. They used civilian ships as guided missiles, overloaded their reactors to create massive explosions, and employed kamikaze attacks that turned every human vessel into a potential weapon. Navigation Officer Beth Cameron calculated hyperspace jumps that brought human ships directly into the heart of Korthani formations in maneuvers that should have been impossible with human technology. Her navigation techniques were based on accepting casualty rates that no civilized military force would consider acceptable, but which the humans seemed to embrace enthusiastically. Ground combat took on an even more disturbing character as human. Resistance forces abandoned any pretense of following conventional military doctrine. They began employing tactics that made their previous efforts seem restrained and civilized by comparison. The humans were no longer fighting to win, but were fighting to make the Korthani pay the highest possible price for every human life lost. Construction. Worker Greg Miller began creating death traps that used his knowledge of structural engineering to turn entire buildings into weapons designed to kill as many aliens as possible. His fortifications were not intended to provide protection for human forces, but were instead designed to collapse in ways that would maximize casualties among attacking Korthani troops. Teacher Claire Adams expanded her psychological warfare operations to include tactics that exploited her understanding of childhood development and educational theory. She began broadcasting messages designed to remind Korthani soldiers of their own families while describing in graphic detail what humans intended to do to every alien they captured. The most disturbing aspect of the human response was the participation of their civilian population in combat operations. Elderly humans who should have been seeking shelter were instead volunteering for suicide missions against Korthani installations. Children were being trained to use weapons and were actively participating in resistance operations. Dr. Lisa Parker transformed her medical facility into a laboratory for developing biological weapons specifically designed to target Korthani physiology. Her research was based on captured alien genetic material and was progressing with terrifying speed toward the development of diseases that would affect only aliens while leaving humans unharmed. Mechanic Tony Vasquez had moved beyond modifying vehicles into weapons platforms and was now creating devices that could only be described as torture instruments designed specifically for use on captured aliens. His workshop had become a facility for developing new ways to inflict pain and psychological trauma on enemy forces. The humans were demonstrating a level of ruthless creativity that shocked even veteran Korthani soldiers who had participated in dozens of previous conquests. They seemed to possess an unlimited capacity for developing new methods of killing, and were applying this ability with focused determination against their alien invaders. Sergeant Nick Collins was no longer content with improving captured alien weapons, but had begun developing entirely new types of devices based on combining human engineering principles with alien technology. His creations were weapons that neither species could have developed independently, but which proved devastatingly effective against Korthani forces. Human communications intercepted during this phase of the conflict revealed that they were treating the destruction of Denver as a declaration of total warfare that removed any remaining constraints on their methods. They discussed Korthani forces with the same clinical detachment that they might use when planning the extermination of dangerous animals. Zefak realized that his strategic decision to target civilian populations had not broken human morale, but had instead removed whatever psychological barriers had been restraining human military capabilities. The destruction of one city had transformed the entire human species into something that he was beginning to recognize as fundamentally more dangerous than any enemy the Korthani had ever faced. The Korthani Empire had never retreated from a conquest in over 1,000 years of military expansion, but Zefek found himself facing an impossible situation that defied every principle of warfare he had learned during 3 centuries of successful campaigns. The humans could not be defeated because they refused to accept defeat, and every victory against them came at such a terrible cost that it felt like losing. The final battle that convinced Zefak to abandon the conquest took place around the human homeworld, where Captain Alex Turner led a squadron of damaged human ships in an attack that embodied everything the alien commander had learned to fear about human warfare. Turner's vessel was burning from multiple hits and should have withdrawn from combat hours earlier, but instead accelerated directly toward the Korthani flagship. As his ship died around him, Turner broadcast human war songs across all frequencies, while describing in graphic detail what would happen to every alien who had participated in the invasion when reinforcements arrived from Earth. His final transmission was a promise that humans would follow the Korthani fleet back to their home systems and would continue fighting until every alien involved in the attack on humanity had been eliminated. Pilot Jennifer Walsh led a fighter squadron in a coordinated suicide attack that destroyed a Korthani command ship through the simple expedient of ramming her fighter directly into the alien vessel's bridge. Her last communication was a detailed message to other human pilots describing the exact approach angle and speed required to penetrate Korthani defensive systems using similar tactics. The moment that crystallized Zefak's understanding of what humanity represented came when he captured a human prisoner named Marine Corporal Danny Foster during ground combat on one of the outer planets. Foster had been leading a small unit in a hopeless defense against overwhelming Korthani forces, but had continued fighting even after his position was completely surrounded, instead of the fear or resignation that Zefak expected from a defeated enemy. Foster looked the alien commander directly in the eye and smiled with what could only be described as anticipation. His expression suggested that he was looking forward to what would happen next, rather than dreading the consequences of capture. "You have no idea what you've started," Foster said, in response to Zefak's demand for information about human military capabilities. "When word gets back to Earth about this, they're going to send ships you can't even imagine. We don't just fight wars. We are war." Foster explained with disturbing enthusiasm that the humans who had been fighting the Korthani invasion represented only a tiny fraction of human military capability. The real human war machine was still located around Earth and consisted of weapons systems that had been developed through thousands of years of continuous conflict against increasingly dangerous enemies. The Marine described human military history as an unbroken chain of technological development driven by the need to kill other humans more effectively than they could kill in return. Every human conflict had produced innovations that were immediately applied to the next war. The cumulative result was a species that had turned warfare into their primary form of technological and social evolution. Zefak realized that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or tactics, but their absolute refusal to accept defeat, combined with their terrifying capacity for adaptation and escalation. They did not fight to win territory or resources, but fought because war was what they were. Combat was not something humans did, but something they fundamentally existed to accomplish. The alien commander understood that every human defeat would simply provide them with information needed to win the next engagement. They would study Korthani, tactics, develop countermeasures, and return with improved weapons and better strategies. The invasion had not conquered humanity, but had instead provided them with valuable intelligence about alien military capabilities. Foster's final words, before Zefak ordered his execution, were a prediction that proved more accurate than the alien commander wanted to admit. "You came here thinking you were going to conquer another primitive species," the Marine said. "Instead, you just gave us our next enemy to practice on. We've been fighting each other for so long that we were getting bored. Thanks for giving us something new to kill." The retreat from human space was the most humiliating experience of Zefak's military career, but he recognized that continuing the campaign would only result in the complete destruction of his fleet. The humans had demonstrated that they were willing to accept unlimited casualties in pursuit of victory, and possessed the technological creativity needed to turn any advantage against their enemies. As his remaining ships escaped into hyperspace, Zefak transmitted a message to Korthani High Command that would change the Empire's expansion policies forever. "Do not engage the humans," he warned. "They are not like any species we have encountered before. War was nothing new to me until I faced human fury directly. Now I understand why they fight each other so often. They're practicing." The message concluded with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the campaign. Establish a quarantine zone around human space and avoid all contact with their species. They do not fight wars. They are war itself, and they have been refining their methods for thousands of years. We are not equipped to face an enemy that views combat as their reason for existing.